the Booker Prize 2019, where the great and the good of the literary world toast the best novelists working today.
This year, 2 of the 4 finalists here at the Booker Prize are of African descent, and there were 4 African writers on the long list. And yet, these facts have hardly been mentioned in the build-up to tonight's event. And that's because it's entirely normal. For decades now, African writers have been winning awards and writing bestsellers. The African continent has become a superpower in the world of the novel.
The Booker Prize of 2019 was controversial because it had 2 winners, Margaret Atwood and Bernardine Evaristo. But this double win perhaps eclipsed the real story of the evening.
I will say that I am the first black woman to win this prize.
Evaristo's historic victory was just the latest chapter in a story that reaches back many decades. From the 1950s, black African writers seized the English language novel to give voice to their experience.
My writing is very political. I don't believe that one is writing a novel simply for amusement.
As African nations became independent, these writers became the conscience of their continent.
His entire life has been about saying that an artist is also a citizen.
And the novel was the form where women writers could tell their own stories.
It was really important, as a very young woman, to hear the voices of people who look like me, because it gives your life meaning.
The African novel then spread around the world, creating books that changed lives, especially here in Britain.
Ben Okri is our poet laureate. When Ben speaks, we listen.
And as writers from the continent have grown in fame, they have even begun to question being pigeonholed as African novelists.
When somebody calls me an African writer, I look at who's saying it.
These novelists created a series of books that were funny, witty, and often tragic. But they achieved something that stretched beyond the world of literature. They helped transform the image of Africa itself.
The story of these great African novels has a deep personal resonance for me. When I was a kid growing up in the UK, my family back in Nigeria would send me and my siblings books like this. And every now and then, a parcel would arrive in the post full of little orange books. And like lots of people of African heritage, these novels by writers like Chinua Achebe and Ngugi Thiong'o, they were where we went to learn about Africa and to learn what it means to be African. But what I didn't know when I was a teenager reading these novels is that books like this, by Africans who were writing about Africa, that they represented a profound break with how Africa had been portrayed in novels right up until the 1950s. The picture of Africa presented to Western readers before these books was a bit of a problem. The most popular novels set in the continent were the boy's own adventures of Rider Haggard. John Buchan's Prester John was hugely popular, the story of a Westerner battling unruly savages. These books were written as entertainment. But one writer took the African adventure story and turned it into something far more troubling. At the beginning of the 20th century, Joseph Conrad published Heart of Darkness. It begins on the Thames as the sailor Marlowe recalls travelling from here to a great river in Africa as he struggles to understand that continent.
Going up the river was like travelling back to the earliest beginnings of the world, when vegetation rioted on the earth and the big trees were kings. The steamer toiled along slowly, on the edge of a black and incomprehensible frenzy. Prehistoric man was cursing us, praying to us, welcoming us. Who could tell?
Heart of Darkness was an attack on European imperialism. But in the 20th century, African writers began to rebel against the idea that their continent should be thought of or described as a place of darkness. And one writer in particular condemned the way European novelists, like Joseph Conrad, had portrayed the people of Africa as passive victims with no inner thoughts or inner lives. What he wanted was for African writers to seize control of the novel and use it to tell their own stories from an African perspective.
This writer who took on the Western canon was the Nigerian, Chinua Achebe. Born in 1930, he was educated under British rule and steeped in the colonial literature of the motherland.
When I was younger, an adventure story was simply an adventure story. And if there were good white people surrounded by cannibals or savages, my sympathies would go with the good white people. I mean, I didn't see any problem there. Later on, I began to see that these stories were in fact saying more than they appeared to be saying when I was younger. And then I read them more carefully. And I began to feel and to think that every people must tell their own story.
Achebe wrote a novel that gave African characters a full sense of humanity. Things Fall Apart, published in 1958, featured a highly complex Nigerian hero, Okonkwo.
Okonkwo ruled his household with a heavy hand. His wives lived in perpetual fear of his fiery temper. Okonkwo was not a cruel man, but his whole life was dominated by fear. The fear of failure and of weakness. It was the fear of himself, lest he should be found to resemble his father.
I think it was the first time I had read a book entirely from a West African perspective. It mattered so much that the experience of reading and inhabiting the life of another person, the mind of another person, was also extended to African people.
The novel was groundbreaking because it looked at colonization from the viewpoint of the colonized. As the characters adapted to British occupation and to the arrival of a new religion.
In the book, it's actually a missionary spreading the kind of, literally the gospel. There was a twin gospel. It was a gospel of Christianity, but also a gospel of British justice, fair play, superiority, whatever you want to call it. I mean, it was multifaceted. And I think the book actually does gently talk about the gospel, but also the military side. You know, all of that put together in a very rich and troubling in many ways, but very rich context.
The white man is very clever. He came quietly and peaceably with his religion. We were amused at his foolishness and allowed him to stay. Now he has won our brothers, and our clan no longer act like one. He has put a knife on the things that held us together, and we have fallen apart.
Things Fall Apart is today viewed as a literary classic. However, it might never have seen the light of day, as there was little publishing industry in Nigeria. But in the mid-1950s, Achebe came to London to train as a radio producer at the BBC.
Great artists need talents, but they also often need luck. And Chinua Achebe's lucky break took place here at the BBC, because one of his trainers was the novelist Gilbert Phelps. Achebe gave Phelps a copy of his manuscript. He realized that what he'd been given was something special. He wrote to a publisher saying he'd made an exciting discovery, the first novel to examine the breakup of tribal life. And that connection between Achebe and Phelps led to the publication of Things Fall Apart and a revolution in African literature.
I don't want to sound melodramatic and say there would be no modern African literature without Chinua Achebe. But actually, I am going to sound melodramatic and say that because I believe that it forced people who otherwise would not have respected writing coming from Africa to respect it. Because you had to respect work that was that sparkling and that true.
Achebe put Nigeria on the world literary map, and he became a role model for writers across the continent. Always outspoken, his attacks on government corruption forced him into exile.
You must criticize yourself. This, to me, is one of the hallmarks of true patriotism, that you see yourself as you are, and you don't accept anything except the best from your people.
But whatever problems he had with the government, the Nigerian people always recognized his astonishing work.
Chinua Achebe was a very brilliant man. He taught us many things. He taught us that we are not just black, we are beautiful.
He died in 2013. His funeral was one of the largest in the country's history. Nelson Mandela said that Achebe had brought Africa to the rest of the world. But Mandela wasn't just talking about the impact of Achebe's writing. Because as well as leaving behind all his novels, Achebe left another legacy, a new generation of African writers who wrote about Africa and about what it is to be African. And they were able to get their voices out onto the global stage. Things Fall Apart was published when Britain still ruled great swathes of Africa. But by the late 1950s, nations on the continent were finally gaining independence.
It's a very touching moment as the Union Jack is brought down in darkness and the Nigerian flag is gradually taking its place to the shouts of all the spectators.
The time was ripe for African writers to tell African stories. But even the best novelists wouldn't get far without an imaginative publisher.
Up there on the second floor of this building is a site of special literary significance because this was where the Heinemann African Writers series had their offices. Now, Heinemann had made their name publishing school textbooks, but from the early 1960s, they began to publish a series of new novels by new African writers. Each book in the series was numbered, and they began with a republication of Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart, which came with a little number 1 stamped onto the spine. So what happened here helped a whole new generation of African writers get their books published and out to new audiences.
With their distinctive branding and cheap prices, readers on the continent devoured this series of paperback books. Their success shone a spotlight on new African voices who made the novel their own.
They're really important, and there's a period in time where all of the greats from across the continent were being gathered together in one place. And when something like that happens, people then are aspiring. So you're writing a novel in isolation, but you're thinking, there's this place that will take my work and will publish me. It was a center of power, and there was a gathering together. But also having a space for writers to look to, an outlet for them to look to. And that was important at that moment in time.
One author published by Heinemann was Ngugi wa Thiong'o. Born in 1930s Kenya, he witnessed the brutality of colonialism at first hand.
One of your volumes of your memoirs opens with you as a small boy returning home from school to your village, which you hadn't seen for several months, and the village has been destroyed. I just wondered how far you still remember that moment today.
The British literally destroyed a whole culture, a whole tradition where our lives were turned upside down. And that image of, after desolation, just returning home after being away for 3 months, and you go to a place where you were born, and all you see are burnt down houses. You don't see anybody. It's an absolute sort of, image of desolation.
His debut novel, Weep Not Child, was published in 1964 under his original name of James Ngugi. It immediately sold out its print run of 10,000 copies. It's about British attempts to suppress and imprison the Mau Mau, an anti-colonial guerrilla army.
The main aim is to try and bring these rather fanatical people back to normal life, to clear the Mau Mau out of their system and bring them back to normal, decent, civilized people again.
The book features a white farmer who despairs as his workers join the rebellion.
Who were the Mau Mau anyway? He asked for the 1000th time. Mere savages. Previously, he had not thought of them as savages or otherwise, simply because he had not thought of them at all, except as part of the farm, the way one thought of donkeys or horses.
Kenya finally achieved independence from Britain in 1963. But for Ngugi, this liberation only produced cosmetic changes.
Everywhere he looked, Ngugi saw the remnants of empire. In Africa, he believed, the Europeans had left behind what he called a cultural bomb. The administrators, the missionaries, the soldiers may have gone, but what they'd left behind was a colonial mindset, one that said that Africa and African languages were inferior. So his mission in writing was simple. He called it decolonizing the mind.
In the late 1960s, he renamed himself Ngugi wa Thiong'o. Eventually, he even abandoned English, preferring to write in his Kenyan mother tongue, Kikuyu.
Language is so basic to any community. And what I found is this, very interesting, that wherever one people have colonized another, they always impose their language.
Ngugi's son, Mukoma, is a celebrated novelist and critic who has a special insight into why his father moved away from English.
When he was writing in English, he was very popular with the elite, right? But he wasn't being read by the people who he was writing for. He didn't want to write a book that his mother couldn't read, because she couldn't read English. He wanted to be in direct communication with his audience.
One of the points that Ngugi made was that people had been convinced that their language was inferior, that they looked to English as just a higher form of language.
Ngugi saw that as reflective of an entire colonial project, which was, the replacing of the African self with a kind of British self, and that was through language for Ngugi.
Appalled at the poverty in his newly independent country, Ngugi embraced Marxism to critique the Kenyan government.
Poverty is like poison in any society. But in fact, when you get a few people getting the lion's share of what is produced by the people of Kenya, then this does not augur well for our society.
In 1980, Ngugi's revolutionary consciousness produced Devil on the Cross, a satire that saw Kenyans impoverished by a criminal conspiracy.
History shows us that there's never been any civilization that was not built on the foundations of robbery and theft. Where would America be today without theft or robbery? What about England? France? It's theft and robbery that have made possible the developments of the Western world.
It became a book of the people, right? Because for the first time, they had this novel that was speaking to the times, we were in the 70s and 80s, where they could recognize themselves in the novel. That novel proves that you do have readers if you write in a language they speak.
The publication of Devil on the Cross was controversial, as Ngugi demanded all African novelists should now write in their mother tongue.
By our continuing to write in foreign languages, paying homage to them, are we not, on the cultural level, continuing that neo-colonial slavish and cringing spirit?
But a counter-argument came from Chinua Achebe, who thought that English was the best way for the African novel to reach a wide readership.
It's always set up as the debate and it's one versus the other. I think there's space for both these perspectives. In Ngugi, of course, his works are now being translated into the English language. So I think translation really is the key. It's rather than Achebe versus Ngugi, it's about how do we make these works more available to more people.
But the debate about language should not diminish the literary importance of Ngugi, a man who many believe should have already won the Nobel Prize for Literature.
If you look at Ngugi wa Thiong'o as a writer and compare a book like A Grain of Wheat to one of his most recent books, there is an astonishing range there in style. A Grain of Wheat is a book that is realist. It is set in the Mau Mau Rebellion. It is deeply political. If you look at Witty, you're looking at something completely different. It's 3-4 times the length. It's got a comedic quality. Extraordinary things happen. People grow huge limbs, ears and noses and feet. So there is this incredible range that he has and a wonderful versatility. And I think, that is his greatest strength as a writer. Not just the politics, but this ability to storytell, to narrate a story in any form he chooses.
After Ngugi, the African novel was defiantly political. The Ghanaian, Aye Kweyama, was the angry young man of African literature. One critic said his work dealt with defeat, decay, frustration, and disappointment. He became famous across the continent because of one shocking novel, The Beautiful Ones Are Not Yet Born, a savage attack on how consumerism and the pursuit of wealth had led to the corruption of the people.
It's ensuring how difficult it is to be decent in post-colonial Ghana, that corruption has reached such an extent that it's impossible for an ordinary person to be simply a decent human being.
How long will Africa be cursed with its leaders? There were men dying from the loss of hope, and others were finding gaudy ways to enjoy power they did not have. We were ready here for big and beautiful things. But what we had was our own black men scrambling to ask the white man to welcome them onto their backs.
But Kweyama was far more than just a polemicist. In his mystical, experimental novel, 2000 Seasons, he travelled far back into Africa's history.
2000 Seasons, for me, is probably one of the most influential books in terms of African literature, and certainly influential on my life. And really, it covers a period of 2000 seasons, from the moment when there was a kind of Arab invasion of North Africa, and for 2,000 years on from there. And it speaks to those who are tasked with seeing, those who are tasked with remembering. How well have they done their job? It's magnificent in its anger and its soul.
That we, the black people, are one people, we know. Destroyers will travel long distances in their minds and out to deny you this truth. We do not argue with them, the fools. Let them presume to instruct us about ourselves. That too is in their nature. That too is in the flow of their 2,000 seasons against us.
It has a passion and a questioning and a consciousness right at the core of it, which is it our job to change the world? Or is it our job to be victims of the world?
In the late 1960s, recently independent Nigeria was torn apart by civil war. Some in the East wanted to break away and form a new state called Biafra. The resulting conflict haunts the imagination of many African writers to this day.
Independence held such promise and such hope. And with the Biafran War, the conflict that ensued was a wound that many people felt. It was a moment in Nigeria's history where all these aspirations and all these hopes and dreams of independence came crashing down, and it ushered in a new era in Nigeria's politics. And so I think for that generation, it was something that many wrote about because it was something that was so traumatic and was so consequential to the development of the nation that they had to try and exercise it through their writing.
One writer was jailed for his attempts to broker a truce during the conflict.
He is the distinguished writer Wole Soyinka, a Nigerian who spent most of the Civil War in prison and who for much of that time was in solitary confinement.
I knew I would be released sooner or later. Either that or I would be quietly done away with in some obscure cell. It was one of two things. So one of them has come to pass, and I suppose it's just a fact.
During his detention, Soyinka was reduced to writing about his experiences using improvised pens and ink.
There's something annoying about being reduced to this children's adventure level, you know, in which you literally recreate tools.
How did
in the age of typewriter, you know, see what I mean.
How did you improvise ink?
Well, I can't tell you. Let's just say that I passed.
No, you're mysterious about that.
I've passed the information on to those who are likely to get in the same situation. You know, one doesn't want to have the material, you know, stop. But you know, I can't talk about it. But it came from the food which I was given.
It's part of the underground wisdom. Now,
Yeah,
is it?
yeah.
It was hard because, you know, essentially they put him in one of the most notorious prisons, so and to really punish him because he was an internationally known writer, but really kind of dehumanize him. So, you know, how essentially saying, how dare you go against this? You know, you might be the internationally acclaimed writer, but in Nigeria, you're nothing.
The novel Season of Anime was Soyinka's attempt to make sense of the terrible things he witnessed during the war.
Ofei wondered, was the bloodlust that seized upon the populace just another legacy of climate? Or was there a truly metaphysical condition called evil that made the people so open to the manipulation of coldly unscrupulous men?
People saw things people shouldn't see. It's that horror of war. Dead bodies littered, you know, on roads and buildings, smashed, and babies killed. So this is shocking. I think he tries to convey that horror because not many Nigerians actually saw that, but they were protected from it. So I think it's a way of registering the degree of dehumanization that had been brought about by the war, but also that was linked to the corruption at the heart of Nigeria itself.
I cannot separate the ills of my society, the repressiveness, the corruption, from the causes of the war. And as a writer, I feel obliged to interpret my experiences in terms of what really is the normal experience of others who haven't got the kind of voice and who do not command the kind of attention I do.
For me, what is most remarkable and most meaningful about Wole Soyinka is not just his writing, it's everything else. It's the man that he is, it's the fearlessness of him. And so the reason that he's been a guiding light for me for many years is that his entire life has been about saying that an artist is also a citizen, that you write your art, but you participate. And that's kind of the attitude that I have about life. And so he, for me, is a model of how you can do it, how you can occupy your space in the world and just be like, yep, this is what I'm doing.
For all the trouble it had caused him in Nigeria, Soyinka's mixture of politics and prose earned him the world's highest literary accolade.
The 1986 Nobel Prize for Literature has been awarded to an African playwright, poet and novelist. He's Wole Soyinka, and he's the first African, indeed the first black, to win the prize in its 85-year history.
Soyinka won the Nobel Prize, and it was a very special moment. It was, in a way, a validation of what we all knew, that Soyinka was an incredible writer, amazing. But also that African writing itself, I mean, it had come of age, and that the writers from Africa were using the English language. They were actually international writers, and that, you know, they're not simply writing a minority literature, but they were actually writing world literature. The Nobel Prize recognized Soyinka as a representative of the African continent.
Soyinka's novels, like those of his great predecessors, were all set on the African continent. But does an African novel have to be set in Africa? This is the Penshurst estate in North London. In the 1960s and 70s, it was home to an author who gave voice to the African diaspora. Buchi Emecheta was born in Nigeria in 1944. But she came to Britain at the age of 18, full of optimism.
I cannot remember when I first heard of the name United Kingdom, but my father gave the name weight in my mind. Whenever he pronounced the title United Kingdom, it sounded so heavy, so reverential. Going to the United Kingdom must surely be like paying God a visit.
Emecheta and her 5 children lived here in the 1960s and 70s. Her experiences on the estate inspired In the Ditch, her debut novel, which showed her disenchantment with the idea of Britain as a promised land. Emecheta described In the Ditch as a documentary novel. It's an account of the life of a woman called Ada as she adjusts to life in the London of the 1960s. In one passage, a neighbour mentions the colour of her skin. Ada is astonished because, for obvious reasons, back in Nigeria, her skin colour is never mentioned, whereas here in London, it will define her entire existence.
Ada jumped. Colour? What colour was he talking about? Well, human nature being what it is, Ada looked at the back of her hand. Mr. Small's eyes followed her movements and smiled. Happy. He had put Ada in her place.
For me, her novels really were documentaries, because I hadn't read any novels up to now that faithfully and realistically depicted what it was like to be black and not so well off in London.
It's also worth noting that she'd studied sociology. So in terms of her academic career, she was a sociologist. And I think her writing became a medium for her to express and to write about the experiences of herself, but also people that were close to her. And so there's sort of this hybrid writing it's a fictionalized account, but it's very much documenting the lives of people like herself And often those are the lives of marginalised people, people that history wouldn't remember, people that wouldn't make it into the history books. But nevertheless, she recognises the importance of these stories.
Emecheta might have begun her literary career on a council estate, but her work was gradually recognised by the cultural establishment. In 1983, Granta took a famous photograph of the best young British novelists. It featured the likes of Ian McEwan, Martin Amis, Pat Barker, but it also featured Buchi Emecheta.
Many people have asked Buchi Emecheta how a Nigerian woman could come to Britain and make a living writing books in a language that is not her first, nor her second or third, but her fourth.
She appeared on the BBC in the 1980s when she discussed her struggle to become a writer.
Your husband burnt your first novel, didn't he?
Yes, yes. He thought I was aiming above my station. And the woman, especially Bo woman, is supposed to be at home, docile, nice, and doing exactly what your husband told you to do. But I started writing a book, but he didn't like that very much, so he burned that book.
I mean, your book is an epic. It's extraordinary. But in retrospect, I think you ought to have a little bit more sense of humour, if that's possible.
Absolutely extraordinary.
Thank you, Buchi.
Emecheta's stardom came about because she'd published her bleak masterpiece, The Joys of Motherhood.
This has got to be one of the most ironic titles ever given to a novel, because there's precious little joy in this tale of a woman who dreams of being a loving, caring mother to her children, but is let down and betrayed at every turn.
The Joys of Motherhood is so beautiful, but also for me so refreshing because it was about women. It was a book that actually said it's worthwhile that what happens to a woman propels a novel. I hadn't seen that before in African literature.
Men. All they were interested in was male babies to keep their names going. God, when will you create a woman who will be fulfilled in herself? A full human being, not anybody's appendage. After all, I was born alone, and I shall die alone.
Sylvester Onwurdi is the son of Buchi Emecheta.
This one I particularly like because it's my mother when she was younger. But what I find striking is just the eyes, because they just remain the same. This kind of piercing gaze, which he always had.
As a child, he didn't realise his mother was a celebrity.
We were aware that she was a writer, but we didn't really understand the significance of what she was doing. We were aware of the kind of what she went through, the process of writing, because it was very much a domestic thing, because she used to write in the kitchen. And so it's very much something we saw every single day. But to actually understand the impact that she had on other people, that only came much later. And for me, really, it was after she died. So she had this impact on particularly women of a certain age. And I think she was a role model because of the fact that she had quite a difficult life and she triumphed against adversity and all those things. And her story is quite a powerful one. So I think that resonated with a lot of people. But also the fact that she was writing about things which nobody else was writing about at that time.
So why is a novelist who made such a mark in the 1970s and the 1980s not better known today?
I think she's a very important voice. I think, though, as a black woman writer, she was somewhat overtaken by the American black women writers, the Alice Walkers and the Maya Angelou's.
Since Emecheta's death in 2017, her son Sylvester has been republishing his mother's novels to get them back in the public eye.
I decided that I was going to make sure that all those books remained in print forever. It also gave me the opportunity to reread all the books again, which is quite interesting. And in a funny way, to rediscover my mother, see her in a completely different light. And I think she'll be gratified that this is happening. And I think it's it's what she deserves, really.
But by the early 1990s, one voice of the African diaspora was to achieve global recognition.
Good evening and welcome to the 1991 Booker Prize for Fiction, coming to you live from Guildhall in London. In just under 50 minutes, the chairman of the judges will announce the winner of certainly the most prestigious of the literary prizes.
The Booker Prize for 1991 goes to Ben Okri for The Famished Road.
Ben Okri was born in Nigeria, but went to school in London. Like Emecheta, his writing speaks as much to Britain as it does to Africa.
Ben Okri is our poet laureate. When Ben speaks, we listen. He has an eloquence and a statesman-like status amongst us Africans in the diaspora. He understands Europe and writes in those traditions and does it very well. But he never forgets his African gaze.
In 1991, Okri became the first ever black writer to win the Booker Prize.
When my first novel was published, I went home and my father rather cunningly got together all the elders of our town, and they contributed a certain amount of money impromptu to buy me a pen to carry on writing. I suppose this will buy me quite a lot of pens.
His Booker-winning novel, The Famished Road, was written in Notting Hill, but it tapped into Nigerian myths in which the living dwell among the dead.
When Ben won the Booker Prize, I think what it signaled to everybody else is that that kind of literature, that kind of imagination, that kind of non-linear way of thinking, that kind of celebration of an African cosmology could be appreciated.
I just love the magic realism in the novel. I loved his prose style. I found it incredibly immersive. And I love the spirituality that he was, the Nigerian spirituality that he was exploring in the novel. So it was just had a profound effect on me.
I dedicate this prize to all those who struggle and who suffer in silence and in public and who never stop fighting and always keep on dreaming. Thank you very much.
Okri's success showed that Africans could write books that were highly experimental, but also that had deep emotional resonance that could connect with readers across the world. And importantly, he also showed that Africans could write books that could break in to the bestseller lists. Aminata Fauna is one of this new generation of writers from the African diaspora. Happiness is centred around a character from Ghana staying in London.
When I came to write Happiness, instead of having the Westerner go to Africa, I brought the African character to the West, and I wanted to show readers what a city like London, a country like Britain, looks like from a West African perspective, to invite Britons to look at themselves from the outside.
Fauna's father was from Sierra Leone, a country that from the early 90s was devastated by 10 years of civil war. Fauna only spent a small part of her childhood in the country, but she brought the war to an international readership in The Memory of Love, which examined the scars left behind by the conflict.
For me, the task of an artist is to hold the pain of a country, to memorialise it, and to find a way to help a country bear it.
He knows nothing about how this will all end, except that it will surely end. He tries to imagine himself into a future, somewhere past this point, but he cannot. There is nothing to do but to keep on existing in this exact time and place. This is what hell must be like, waiting without knowing. Not hell, but purgatory. Worse than hell.
The Memory of Love tears you apart. It's a book that takes you into direct aftermath of war and deals with quite severe trauma, but not in a way that is watching. It's in a way that forces you as the reader to experience it at many different levels, and also to experience the difficult decisions people make about survival.
What has been the reaction of Sierra Leonean readers to your books that examine that trauma of that war?
I don't expect Sierra Leoneans actually to, sit and read all my work, but the fact that the work exists and it exists for future generations, I think is tremendously important.
But Fauna's novels also range beyond the bounds of Africa. Her 2013 book, The Hired Man, was set in Croatia. And she is suspicious of that catch-all label, African novelist.
When somebody calls me an African writer, I look at who's saying it. If a Sierra Leonean says to me she's a Sierra Leonean writer, I love that, right? They're claiming me. At other times, as somebody who is frequently labelled, I'm suspicious of labels because labels are put on people in order to try to constrain them, in order to try to distill them down to only one thing. And it's impossible nowadays to do that. It's been impossible forever, actually. But, it is self-evidently impossible nowadays. We live in a global context. So it doesn't make sense to call somebody an African writer unless you also accept that that person is many other kinds of writer as well.
These labels are always reductive, and writers are always railing against them. I mean, I'm also called a Black British writer, but actually I own it because that is the perspective from which I write. But at the same time, white writers don't often wear these labels. White, male, middle-class writers are not called that. So I can see that it's problematic, and I understand why it's problematic, but I can see that it also serves a function, just in terms of identifying who we are and what we might be writing about.
I will do all kinds of acrobatics to avoid saying African writer, so a writer of African descent or a writer from an African country and all of those things, because I too have problem with that, because African writer has come to be something that seeks to limit what someone does. And so I think that, Aminata's refusal of a term or refusal to be bound by that is absolutely right, because we lose something when we say, well, you should only be able to write about this continent or this family or this region, because the themes that are being explored are much wider than that.
One writer who has transcended the label African novelist is Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. Set in both Nigeria and America, her 3 diverse books fight against Western stereotypes of Africa.
Those stories have been told so often and are told so singularly that they start to define an entire place, and you cannot understand Africa if that's the only thing you know about it.
Her most famous novel, Half of a Yellow Sun, looks back to the Biafran War. But it is as much a tale of love and youthful idealism as of the conflict itself.
A student leader spoke into the microphone and the singing stopped. Some young men were carrying a coffin with Nigeria written on it in white chalk. They raised it up, mock solemnity on their faces. When they lowered the coffin into the hole, a cheer rose in the crowd and spread, ripple-like, until it was one cheer. Until Olana felt that everyone there had become someone.
Do what I tell you. Cover up as I say.
I decided to write about Biafra because I grew up in the shadow of Biafra. And my grandfathers died in the war, my parents lived through it, they lost everything they owned. And so when you're born into a family that was deeply affected by something that you did not experience, I think that if you're a storyteller, there's something in you that then wants to try and make sense of it through storytelling.
I think what Chimamanda is able to do in Half of a Yellow Sun is to weave quite masterfully a sort of a history. There's a real sense of what happened in the build-up to the war and during the war, but that's not at the expense of the human story.
This is actually why you have to tell the story, because it's important for us to remember. I really think it's important to remember. I think we live in a society that is so eager to forget. And when we forget, it's not just that we risk repeating what happened in the past, which I think is obviously reason enough to remember, but also that we should remember for the sake of remembering. We should remember because the people who passed away deserve to be remembered.
Adichie is important, not just for her books, but because her writing has made her a global celebrity, a role model for other novelists.
Chimamanda occupies space in many different spheres in a way that I haven't seen other writers do. And she seems to have captured the public's imagination.
I think prior to Chimamanda, it was like you had to look a certain way if you were an author. And then she came along and just tossed that out the window. So it became cool to be a writer and be fashionable.
In Adichie's wake, authors like Soyinka and Braithwaite now have the freedom to write best-selling genre fiction. Braithwaite grew up in Britain but moved to Nigeria as a teenager. The country's commercial capital, Lagos, is a huge inspiration on her writing.
There are things that my characters get away with that I think is because they're in Lagos. Lagos is mad, which is why it's a great backdrop for a thriller. Lagos is a crazy, crazy, crazy place, and there's so much range. You can be living in Lagos and feel like you're living in Dubai, for example. You got everything. And then not too far away from you, there's someone who doesn't know where their next meal will come from. There's so much going on. It's material for every genre, to be honest.
Her debut novel uses the city as a backdrop for a darkly subversive crime story, My Sister, the Serial Killer.
I'm just drawn to women who don't fit those molds. In life, we're not all pure, we're not all good, we're not all kind. Also, writing about a character who's perfect from morning to night is really boring. Writing about imperfect characters is a lot of fun.
Have you heard this one before? Two girls walk into a room. The room is in a flat. The flat is on the 3rd floor. In the room is a dead body of an adult male. How do they get the body to the ground floor without being seen? First, they gather supplies.
My Sister, the Serial Killer is the book that I am most jealous of because I wish I had published that book. I think it's brilliant. But I know that you wouldn't get My Sister, the Serial Killer without volume. All of the writers who've come before her had to have been publishing and selling their work at different levels that then allows it to break out so it becomes a book that you see everybody reading. And the fact that we've reached the point where we can be making noise about a book that's about a young African girl who's a serial killer seems to me such an achievement and such a wonderful thing for us to have reached that point.
The African novel has come a long way since Achebe's masterpiece, Things Fall Apart, a book set in Nigeria with a flawed and tragic protagonist. Today, African novelists can emerge from London as well as Lagos and follow the stories of not just one hero, but of 12 heroines. Bernardine Evaristo's Girl, Woman, Other conveys a panorama of the Black British experience. It begins with Amma as she strolls by the Thames.
Amma is walking along the promenade of the waterway that bisects her city. A few early morning barges cruise slowly by. To her left is the nautical-themed footbridge with its deck-like walkway and sailing mast pylons. To her right is the bend in the river as it heads east past Waterloo Bridge towards the dome of St. Paul's. She feels the sun begin to rise, the air still breezy before the city clogs up with heat and fumes. A violinist plays something suitably uplifting further along the promenade. Amma's play, The Last Amazon of Dahomey, opens at the National tonight. I wanted to write a novel about Black British women, and I wanted to create as many protagonists as possible. who would feature in the novel on an equal footing. And eventually I settled on 12 co-protagonists, and the novel is about their lives.
Her book is not an easy book. It's one that challenges you. She bends the form of what a novel can be in a way that's very exciting, and I hadn't seen before in quite that way. It's something she's always done, but she kind of perfects it here.
I wanted to show multiplicity, in a sense, as a weapon against invisibility and stereotyping. That's why it was important that I would not aim to represent Black British womanhood, because we can't be represented, because we are as pluralist as any other individual in this society, but I just wanted to show the spread of who we can be, the possibility and the possibilities of who we are. That was my intention.
And of course, it's a novel that made history by winning the Booker Prize.
Bernardine Evaristo for Girl, Woman, Other.
I was genuinely surprised when my name came out of the chair's mouth. I was like, oh my God, I was swearing.
But Evaristo wants her success to be just the start of the story.
I'm a diversity champion and I have been all my life, so, you know, I would really like another Black woman to win the Booker Prize in the next few years. If that doesn't happen, and there are always sort of worthy contenders for these prizes, and if that doesn't happen, then I'm going to kick up a fuss.
Bernardine winning it is fantastic. It's taken so long for an African woman to win the Booker Prize. And, you know, she's not going to be the last.
These prizes are important. I mean, it's been a breakthrough moment for my career, but I don't want it just to be a breakthrough moment for my career. I want people to be, you know, coming up really quickly and walking off with the Booker.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you to the judges, of course. Phenomenal. You know, 1 man, 4 women. It made a difference, I think. 2 women of colour. That made history. So thank you so much.
It would be crazy to me to judge a book prize without looking to African writers of all generations, because I think what they're doing is so creative, so bold in pushing the boundaries of the novel, of narrative, of the literary form, that you can't have a serious prize without looking at the writers coming out of Africa.
Today, hugely successful novels written by Africans are just part of the cultural mainstream. And modern African writers are still inspired by authors like Chinua Achebe and Buchi Emecheta. It's been an extraordinary journey since Chinua Achebe's groundbreaking novel.
Story is power, and this seems to me to be so basic to our humanity that every generation will discover.
To a new wave of authors who've turned the African novel into a global business.
It has always been my dream to be around at the tipping point where African writing is no longer foreign. We're close to that, and to me that's the best thing for readers, really is.